Well, the subjects of God and morality are never very far apart. In part 6 of this particular video series, I dealt with the subject of suffering, and I asked some questions. I gave some examples of suffering that's happened over the years, and how that relates to God and the idea that He's compassionate and benevolent. I don't want to look at the conclusions of that video because I want to take a particular position for granted for the basis of this video. You know, some Christians claim that you can't apply the morality that applies to us to God, that a different morality applies to God. That seems a strange position from a Christian perspective, because Christians make out that all morals are absolute. From an atheist perspective, or certainly from an evolutionary perspective, we would say that that's not true. We wouldn't expect the things that would apply to a dog to apply to a dolphin. And similarly, for different types of beings, for different types of entities, we could well imagine that they may have different moralities, that different standards may apply to them. So let's take that on board then. Let's assume that for God that a different morality applies. Does that still cause us any problems? Well, before I start talking about God specifically, I want to bring up a more general case. And I think this is something that is universally accepted in almost all cultures, in almost all walks of life, which is that parents have a responsibility to their children. They have a moral responsibility to their children. And I don't just mean to look after their children, but to pass a morality on to their children. Children are, by their very nature, very good mimics, and they tend to pick up on what their parents do. It's because of this that we have to be careful what we do in front of the children. When we cross the road on our own, we may take a few liberties, but we need to teach our children the correct way to cross the road. Because if they start mimicking our behaviour, well, their road crossing skills are not sophisticated enough to define when you can take liberties and when you can't. This also applies more to the moral sphere, and it applies to things like, let me give an example of swearing. You know, we all swear to some extent, or nearly all of us do. But we as adults are sophisticated to know when we can do it and when we can't. Our children aren't that sophisticated. So when the children are there, when the children are looking and listening, we moderate our behaviour. If we swear all the time, we'll end up with children who swear all the time and swear when it's totally inappropriate. So we have to be careful what we do in front of the children, whether it's bad language or whether it's sexual activity or whether it's quite complicated areas of morality where we may take something that isn't ours but we're doing it in a legitimate way, we're going to pay it back, but our children might not see it in that kind of a way. I think the vast majority of you watching this video will be quite happy with everything I've said so far. You'll agree with everything I've said. But let's look at God's behaviour. We've already said, we've accepted for the purposes of this video that everything He does is moral from His point of view. But it's quite clear that those things aren't moral from our point of view. Just allowing people to die in horrific agony is not moral from a human perspective. To allow people to be swept away in tsunamis or buried alive in an earthquake without warning them, if you knew about it and you could do something about it, that's not moral from a human perspective. But what we're saying is, from God's perspective, it's fine. Okay, but here's the rub. God is doing this in front of the children. He's the Father, we are the children. At least that's the Christian perspective on things. And so, let's accept for the moment that what He is doing is moral from His perspective. But can anybody really argue with the point that even though it may be moral from His perspective, He shouldn't be doing it in front of the children? If He's guilty of anything, at the very least He is guilty of doing things in front of us that He shouldn't be doing in front of us. Because what's the conclusion? What's the only thing that can happen? We're liable to take His lead. We're liable to follow His example. We're liable to mimic His behaviour. We are sponges. Christians look to their God for a lead. They look to His God for an example. Now, in His Jesus incarnation, He actually sets a pretty good example. But in the Father incarnation, the example He sets is no good to us. He shouldn't be doing it when we're looking. He shouldn't be doing it in front of the children. And so it's for this reason that I ask this question. If what the Christians say turns out to be true, and God is our Holy Father, is He a good Father? Or is He failing? Is he actually failing at the first hurdle and failing to do the main thing that any parent has to do for their children, which is to set them a good and appropriate example? Thank you.